It's so lovely to be here. I've travelled from Sheffield in the north of England, and it's been such a pleasure to meet some of you over the last day or two. I would like to talk about what it takes to build successful service organisations. And by that, I mean, as we do all of our work on how to make good products and services, that we want to look at how we create the organizations around those things that are supportive of our work. And to start off this, I want to share a story about an organization that takes eye care, so does eye tests in low or middle income countries where it's hard to get access to eye clinics. So there is no doctor or hospital nearby. If people struggle with vision, then they are really left by themselves. In fact, some people are not aware that they struggle with vision. They just see their children struggling in school and don't really understand why. So they travel to different homes in different villages, and they do eye tests. So they call on people and they ask them if they'll be willing to do an eye test. And the whole organization has about 7 people in it. So there are developers, there's a designer, there are clinicians, and together they're able to figure out what criteria are working well, so they can see for themselves what bits are working and what aren't. And it's only by being there with the user in the context that they can tell what they needed to make a successful service. And not only that, they also needed to see every single bit of what it takes to actually get people to treatment, because it was one thing to be able to test people's eyes. It was another thing to persuade them to set up the appointment, to set up the travel and transport, to actually let people know when their appointment was. These are people who don't necessarily have the same date system or understanding, so they needed to work with village chiefs and elders to actually kind of get people to the appointment on time. And then they had to actually be people who could treat people, so they had to make those arrangements too. And that's what we think about when we think about the whole service. So it's not just the app on the phone that can do the eye test. It was everything involved, because for this organization, they're really focused on avoiding blindness and being able to prevent that happening in the world. This is a really nice example of a whole team, a multidisciplinary team working together to learn, test, and iterate their way towards a successful product or service. And I know that there are loads of people in this room that like to work in these ways, that do work in these ways. The problem is that when we are based in large organizations doing this, our role is to try to bring these kinds of different ways of working, different processes, different techniques into our organizations to show them how it's possible to do things really differently. But the way our organizations work is, if you don't know how to get your governance through, if you don't know our processes, then we're just going to sideline you. So on the one hand, we have in teams bringing modern new ways of working into our organizations. On the other hand, the organizations say, well, we don't understand how you're working. You're going to need to come to this governance forum. It meets in 3 months' time. We will make the decision about whether your thing can go ahead. Meanwhile, you can see the evidence of which way you should go. So something doesn't work. And on the one hand, you have this very cool process for learning, iterating, taking on board what really happens for humans out there. And on the other side, you have this process which is much more about upfront design, making all of the decisions in separation, turning them into requirements, and then having a team go and build those things. And one is built for learning, testing, and making sure it works. The other is based on scale. And the thing for scale doesn't involve learning and testing and iterating. And the process for learning and testing, iterating isn't so easy to scale. That eye test example works because the whole organization is only 7 people. So we have a bit of a problem. And with that second example of the process that we follow, we have this situation. And it just shows a glimpse of all of the different relationships between organizations, between groups, between teams that are behind the scenes of some of the products and services we work on. This is an example, it's a real example. It was all of the different relationships before the pandemic response that existed in the UK with all of the different health organizations. And if you imagine for a moment the team trying to build a vaccination service, this was what they were confronted with. All of the different teams and people and organizations that would need to be brought along. And you can just imagine how hard that was. On the one hand, you have the imperative to get as many people vaccinated as possible. On the other hand, you have something like this that could take 6 months or 12 months to begin to navigate, even just to communicate. And this is not unusual. In fact, most large organizations would have a diagram like this if they revealed their process of decision-making. And it can be quite a clever thing to actually make a diagram like this for your own organization and then show it to leadership who are often horrified by how difficult they've made it to actually deliver good work. This will be familiar to some of you. There's been a lot of work in the UK government to really focus on making services better, findable, usable, understandable, so that people can use them to do the things that they need to do, whether that's to get a passport or a driving license or become a teacher. And what's been interesting is looking at the language used. So here are some examples of how a service was previously called and how they've been able to change it using a verb stating plainly what the service is there to do. And there's an interesting project by one government department to actually list everything that they do in terms of services to their end users. And this is another really helpful practice that you can do with your own organizations. You don't need permission. You can just have a go, pick a verb, state it as an end user would see it, and then you've got something interesting to start to show people. And when you come across teams doing work or you're asked to do work, you can be like, how does this relate to some of what we're trying to make happen here? It gives you a bit of context. And when we talk about service design, it's really about helping our organizations to start to see what they do from an external perspective, so as their users, and then look at all the different pieces and how well joined up they are. And often, when you look at services at this level, there's a ton of different teams involved, different tasks. Hardly anybody sees it as a whole. Sometimes it's even different organizations that provide different parts of these services. And there's very few people that are looking across being like, how well does this all hang together? If we want people in government, but also the private sector, to do the right things, to have bank accounts, to get loans, to get mortgages, how are we looking at how well this whole thing works? And when it doesn't work well, it's not good for customers and users, but it's also responsible for a lot of the ways in which it costs the organization money to run the service. So whenever people can't find the service, they call the contact center. Whenever people are confused, they apply for the wrong thing. And then the casework or the decision-making has a ton more work to do for no good reason. So you can trace back a really kind of compelling financial business case to some of how our services don't work well for the people outside them. Organizations as a whole don't always recognize this as a problem. For many, they are organized around different functions that don't necessarily talk to each other. So for some people, they might think that everything that they're doing is brilliant. There's no need to change anything. But most individual people feel the pain of this. And it comes up in things like duplication, or nobody having a clear sense of if all the work that we're doing, does it add up to make some meaningful difference for what our organization's trying to do overall? So as an individuals, everybody recognizes the problem of there being not so much join up across our whole organizations. And whenever a company or a part of government wants to change something or focus on something, the instinct is always to set up governance or talk about the governance rather than the work. And that means that over time, layers and layers of different boards, committees, working groups, sub-boards are set up all over the place. And then over dozens of months or even years, this is where you get to that crazy diagram of it being utterly complicated to be able to get work done. And that's something that we have to change if we want to be able to make better products and services in the world. Our large organizations, many organizations actually, but they were never designed to deliver whole services end to end. For historical reasons, their structures are very different and quite separated. But what makes this hard when we're trying to do the work to create good products and services and technology is also simply the work to be done. I think I used to go somewhere and I think, well, if only the leadership would get this, if only these processes weren't so completely insane, if only we had people would understand the value I bring as a service designer or as a user researcher, then it would be okay. And I've shifted my perspective to, actually, it's the responsibility of everybody, leadership and all of us, to actually change these things. This is the work that we need to do. And there are really good examples of teams and people and individuals doing this work alongside creating better products and services. So I just wanted to share a few examples to celebrate those that are sort of taking these steps. One example of this is, it's a service, it's called Making or Registering a Lasting Power of Attorney. It's basically the instructions that you would leave with somebody so that if you were ill or poorly, then someone else could make decisions on your behalf. And this service in the UK dramatically increased in the volume of people wanting these in place because of the pandemic. So lots of people were wanting their families to have their instructions in place about what to do. The problem was the service and the people couldn't keep up with the number of applications for these things. It came to the stage where there were bottlenecks, queues of 4, 5, 6 months before these were being processed at a time when people needed them urgently. So they did amazing work around usability testing to make much clearer forms and ways of gathering this data. But back in 2019, they also foresee that there was a problem with the way that the policy was written, because it said you had to complete this on a paper form. And as a result, the organization was dealing with 19 million bits of paper every year. By law, they had to operate by paper. So while doing good work to improve the form, to get better data, they also started the work to change the policy, because policy and service design are so closely interlinked. And eventually, as of recently, in fact, this year, they've been able to change the policy, and now the service can operate entirely digitally, entirely by paper, or a combination, depending on what works for the people that need to do these things. And that's what's going to help them to actually run a much more efficient service that gets people what they need in time. And sometimes we can be bogged down on what our individual tasks are, rather than looking at the overall outcomes. And there's a really good piece of work in an organization called Citizens Advice, where the product managers there often work on internal products, so tools that support advisors to provide advice for people. And they've managed to introduce a more outcomes-focused work by being really clear that all of their work, as they're making these products, should result in improvements to advisor efficiency. That's their number one goal, the number one metric they're looking at. The problem was the way that decision-making worked around that was not the same. They were like, well, have you shipped the thing or not? And they were like, well, the thing is already shipped, it's live. What we're trying to do is improve the efficiency. So it was a difficult conversation to have. they managed to work with this governance group and actually change some of the membership and clarify that what they're trying to do is improve advisor efficiency. They set themselves targets. So in 12 months, can they improve advisor efficiency by 10%? And then that gives the explainer for all of the work they're doing. And the board members have gone on a journey themselves. So this is a very new way of working, but they feel so much more informed, and it means they've been able to use their time to clear the barriers out of the way of this team because they really understand the value it can bring. And this team, having just started by themselves, nobody asked them to work in this way. They've just been able to start making it happen. And now the wider organization is trying to roll this out to more areas across the organization. Here's an example from the world of insurance. And when you have very complicated organizations, complicated services, there are so many different moving parts: the technology, the data, the processes, the teams, the functions, and so on. So what this organization did was set a relationship and a hierarchy between all of the things that come together to deliver a service that were previously thought of as entirely separate. They might have their own data strategy, their own technology strategy, their own operational strategy, all completely separate. So by bringing them together, they were able to set an overall picture of where we're trying to move to with our services, and then what does that mean for all of the different bits of delivery, the different components of that. And they've been able to make this a much more kind of cohesive approach, so that when something bad happens, they're much better positioned to be able to respond to it and to know all of the different parts involved to be able to make a good response. This has interesting implications for leadership, because in many organizations, you have leadership that matches the structures. So you have leadership of individual functions, even at executive level. So there isn't anyone necessarily incentivized to start looking across the organization. There are a few organizations in both the private and public sector that are starting to try a whole service leadership role. So that's someone with operational accountability for everything that works across that service. They're not the only person, they're working with other leads of all the different parts, but it's their job to hold the overall vision, their job to know about the performance of that service as a whole, and then to take influences, whether that's from executives, whether that's from ministers and government, and sort of corral it all together, and to be the person to say, actually, no, we can't do it like this. This is much more of a priority. Or realizing that a team's come up with some very interesting evidence that some approach doesn't work, they can be the person that that team goes to actually hold space and take accountability for doing the right work. And it's not an easy role. They can't just do it by themselves. They need supporting kind of governance structures around them to do this. But it's a really interesting model, and some of the parts of the UK government have made this an official role. So it's published, job descriptions published on the internet, and it's really interesting how this is being taken up in other industries like banking and insurance also. This also has an impact on some of the internal functions, like HR and finance and commercial and procurement, all of these functions around. What it kind of means is that these become enablers to the people and teams that are doing the work, like doing the valuable work of services. So rather than being entirely separate and just worried about compliance, it has a shift so that they become enablers of how well our services as an organization work. And here's just an example of all of the different functions of an HR listed as more of a supporting set of services for people. So it really has implications for every function in an organization. And then one final example is really of how, as we start to introduce this, it's really about a shift to moving towards more continuous improvement of all of the parts of our services that we offer. And that has implications for how organizations approach change. So it's less of a one-off, Here is how we do change. We're going to communicate it. We're going to roll it out. Then it's done. Then we all go home. Much more in favor of, okay, we are always going to be changing. There's always going to be new technology risks, opportunities that come up. There's always going to be interesting new ways in which our customers start interacting with us or expecting to. We can't just think our job is done. And so there's a team in the UK who work on a sort of welfare and financial support service. And they've set up an entire rhythm of working. So on Friday, they get together and decide what's going to be in the release. They make changes on a 2-weekly basis, despite this being a service that involves thousands and thousands of people working in physical locations to help people. So on a Friday, they'll decide what's going into the next release. On a Monday, Tuesday, they'll communicate that, and they've identified people in every single job centre whose job it is to understand it, question it. They'll shut down the offices on a Wednesday morning for 2 hours so that everybody's got the chance to figure out what's happening, what's changing, what it means, so that by Thursday, Friday, everybody's in a really good position with the latest information to start helping their customers and users. So it really becomes an entire way of operating in order to support this continuous improvement of all of the parts of our services. And really where we're trying to get to is in building organizations that can do this well. So that means people looking at whole service performance, not just performance for their individual parts. Where it makes sense to, bringing in our amazing processes of learning and iterating that are second nature to many of us, that are quite alien to some of our organizations. And it has a huge impact on culture. Speaking with culture a lot with people yesterday, some ways of working that are ingrained that we need to change. And that starts with leadership and other people role modeling that working differently, behaving differently, and creating a much more supportive environment from all of the teams and functions around us. And it also means changing how our organization's decision-making works as well. So delegating much more, giving clear parameters and direction without forcing upfront requirements in all ways. Clarity on who can make decisions at what level. So all of this kind of comes together as one package. And generally, in all of these size organizations, prioritization is always a problem. So the way that we can bring help and support to help people prioritize the right kind of work is pretty much always welcome, no matter where you're working. And as a model, I sort of think of it a little bit like this. The work is understanding what's maintaining the status quo. So if something's not working in our organizations, why? Where's that coming from? What's upholding that? And then what are the ways that we can find to constructively change it, work it, challenge it, cut through it? And that cycle repeats, because then there'll be the next issue to look at and the next issue. And ideally, you're part of a group doing this. It's not just you alone. It's ideally the role of a leadership group taking this on. But if it isn't, I just wanted to share 4 things that we can do this week or start to do this month to help bring some of this about. The first one is really about finding the right people. So there's always somebody else who cares about the things that you care about across your organization. There's also some people that are really well placed, so they might not understand fully what you're on about, but they're really well placed. They've got instincts about the right ways to land things, the positioning, the how to communicate, the how to link it to other initiatives that are already happening. And they can help anticipate obstacles and then make the right connections. So these people always exist. Finding them is incredibly valuable, and even if you just have a quick 5-minute chat with them, they can often have a hugely amplifying effect. The second one is really understanding that horrible diagram. Like, what is your equivalent in your organization? Horrible diagram of all of the teams and organizations. And that's because we often talk about how important it is to have empowered teams, but that doesn't exist in isolation. In the bigger organizations, there's always this structure. So understanding what it is and how it works and which bits matter. So not all of these boards and groups matter. There's some of them you can completely ignore. Some of them will be quite directive. So getting to know how they work. And looking out for when big groups come together to theoretically make decisions, But it's not. It's just about communication. So that's when you get committees and boards and groups that are just too big that you can't get sensible decisions out of them. Third one, just do some preparation so that at any time, at some point, you'll be with the right person having a conversation. So knowing the domain and the organization enough to demonstrate that you know what you're talking about, that you're not just talking about some ideal process from somewhere else. And all organizations will have some really core, gritty issues that everybody cares about. So understanding what those are and then thinking about what this approach brings to help answer those is usually the way into all of these conversations. And ideally avoiding doing it in too tribal a way. So coming with openness and wanting to work with different disciplines to approach this. And then finally, make it real and tell the story. So pick one whole service to start to do this on. Make a big map, look at all of the different teams involved, start to show what this looks like in one place. It helps make it much more tangible for people. And you can just do this, you don't need permission. You can just say, well, this is probably wrong, but here's a quick sketch I made. Where might we go to next to develop this? And then finally, you can sort of make a roadmap of the examples of this, and then expose the trade-offs, and then look to the future and work back from there, the practical steps that you can take. So just to finish, this is big work to change an organization. It can feel like a roller coaster, and some days you feel like it's incredible. You've made the most wonderful change. Everybody seems on board, and then the next day you feel like you've taken 5 steps back. So always look a year back to see how far you've come. And good luck. It's such important work that's so valuable to the people outside our organizations that need our products and services. Thank you.
Well, it is big work to say the least. It's like, feels more like monumental. I really respect the patience and the effort for tackling these challenges. Do we have any questions? Over there.
You go.
Yeah, I'm running up that hill. Please just not go down under while I walk. There you go.
Hi, thank you very much. Very interesting. I am a service designer, and I always worked in organizations. So big organization, and I'm working in the government. So I wanted to ask, because I haven't seen in the presentation, do you think that, so as designer, we can help human resources understand this kind of tips you gave? Because I think that in organization, who leads the human resources needs to understand this. And it's not just a matter of research, design, or being a service organization. So,
yeah, really, I think there's really great insight there. You know, I was saying there's always someone who cares, and I think that is definitely an area that should care, that probably do care, that might not necessarily know that they would care. It's been very interesting how some HR areas are renaming themselves people and organization, P&O. And I think that places it quite front and center to be some of the people that are supporting this. There's many angles, I think, that it's yes or yes, very, very worth talking to them about this stuff. And there's a few angles they can help, like it generally is a much more satisfying way to work if you're sort of learning, testing, iterating, working in those ways. So there's a really interesting angle around retention. There's also support around hiring. So how can HR kind of help to bring and help to support kind of the kind of collaboration and cross-functional working that's required here too. So I think there's both ways in which they would understand it and want to help it, and then there's some practical ways that they can work together to help as well. So yeah, find the right person within the HR function to start with. It would be fascinating to have a conversation there. Yeah, nice.
Swell. Any other questions? Nobody? Okay. So thank you very much for this talk.
Thank you.